MeasuringHistory.com presents Common Themes of the 1930s, 1960s, and 2010s. Basically, this comes about because of a common trio. Saturn, Uranus, and Pluto show up throughout these periods, and also actually even going back to 1875, but we're going to concentrate on 30s, 60s, 2010s, a little of the 2040s. And one of the reasons why it's important to talk about this is because all of these times are turning points in our recent history, and the other reason is to illustrate that history or astrology that mirrors history shows that it's never just one thing. We can never just say it's Saturn-Pluto or Uranus-Pluto. We have to also look at the combination of outer planet waves, especially when they happen within about a year or two of each other. One reason, the propensity of the proximity of Saturn-Pluto, Saturn-Uranus, and Uranus-Pluto waves comes from the fact that Uranus-Pluto has a higher frequency than Uranus-Neptune or Neptune-Pluto waves, and therefore it appears more frequently, as we see in these highlights for the 21st and the 20th centuries, respectively. Going back to 1875, we see the Uranus-Pluto opening square connected to the 1850 Uranus-Pluto 1965 wave, and then we also get the same with the 1902 wave. I want to really reserve talking about that until a much later date because that's a really complex era. As we can see, the 1930s, the Depression and the rise of fascism and the backdrop for World War II coincided with the midpoint of the 1915 Saturn-Pluto 1947 wave, and also the three-quarter point of the 1897 Saturn-Uranus 1942 wave. So along with the closing square of the Uranus-Pluto wave pointing back to the 1930s, we get the intersection between the beginning of World War I, which we have with the beginning of that Saturn-Pluto wave in 1915, and the end of World War I with the midpoint of the Saturn-Uranus wave. And we can confirm this by looking at the outer planet chart first of the date that Germany invaded Poland in 1939. We have the Saturn closing square with Pluto right before, a couple years before, the conjunction between Saturn and Uranus. So within that couple year period that we specified at the beginning of this video, we see that again Saturn-Pluto, Saturn-Uranus is involved. And a particular note of the full chart is the fact that the Saturn-Uranus square of 1939-1940 falls right on the moon's node, the nodal axis. And then when we get to the 1960s, obviously a significant turning point. We get the twin oppositions of Saturn to the Uranus-Pluto conjunction, Saturn to Uranus, Saturn to Pluto. So again, we get the same three outer planet waves: Saturn-Uranus, Saturn-Pluto, and Uranus-Pluto. Of course, now we begin the new Saturn-Pluto wave, 1966 Uranus-Pluto 2104. So hints of the 21st century in the 1960s, but significantly the midpoint of the 1947 Saturn-Pluto 1982 wave lands us at the peak of the Cold War, and the midpoint of the Saturn-Uranus wave, Saturn 1942, Uranus 1988, lands us right in the middle of the World War II related dominance of the United States on the global sphere. That came about because of not only World War I, but World War II significantly really put the United States on the world stage. In the United States, we can see domestically the connection between the 1930s and these outer planet waves in the fact that in 1965, Medicare passed. That was obviously a legacy of the 1930s, something that the Roosevelt administration had wanted to get done but couldn't. So that and the Big Society, which LBJ championed, are also extensions of 1930s thinking and 1930s philosophy. And of course, that also leads to basically the inroads for the current fight about Medicare and Medicaid led by the Republicans in the United States. And note that the Saturn-Uranus-Saturn-Pluto connection holds forth in 2010, so there's also a connection there. And then when we get to the 2010s and actually the 2000s, when we look at 9/11 and actually in more in detail when we look at August 6, 2001, the date that the Bush administration ignored security warnings about Al-Qaeda, Saturn and Pluto were exactly opposite. So midpoint of the 1983 Saturn-Pluto 2020 wave. And then also 2001 and 2000 with Uranus, we get the connection between, remember 2000 was the bitter election fight between Al Gore and George Bush, so that was the background atmosphere, the politics of the time. Bush had low approval ratings before the attack, and then of course when we can connect the 2001, the results or the aftermath of 2001, the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, the effect on the economy, the effect on the U.S. standing in the world, all point to 2001. And again, when we look to 2010, we see the Saturn-Pluto, Saturn-Uranus connection, and also the Uranus-Pluto connection. So significantly, we can see that when we have Saturn and Pluto and Saturn-Uranus together, we also get turning points, maybe not as significant as ones with Uranus-Pluto, but we have to always consider them. And then looking forward from the 2010s and of course the 2020s, at the 2020 we get the beginning of the next Saturn-Pluto wave and the three-quarter point of the Saturn-Uranus wave. So we have to consider that when we look at the 2020s, and then that stretches back. That starts to stretch into the 2040s. That's when we're really going to start to see the new episode. Saturn and Pluto, as always, relates to Saturn to historical episodes dating all the way back to the medieval times and before that. So Saturn-Pluto is a real big indicator, and Saturn-Uranus has to be considered with that in the 2020s. And then when we get from the 2020s to the 2040s, we of course will have, before the Uranus opposite Pluto squared by Saturn T-square of 2045, we'll get the Uranus-Neptune T-square involved with Saturn. So, but significantly with the 2045, again, we see Saturn-Uranus, Saturn-Pluto, and Uranus-Pluto coming together. And the 2040s, in my opinion, begins a big stretch that goes all the way to the 2080s. And we can see at the end of the 2080s, again, we get Saturn-Pluto, Saturn-Uranus, and Uranus-Pluto. It'll be interesting to see the last phase of the Uranus-Pluto wave that began in 1966. It would be interesting if they point to measuring history in about 70 years and see what they say about the closing Uranus-Pluto wave and how it's connected to the 1960s, to the internet that began then, to integrated circuits. All of those things will have some sort of signature going into the 2070s, but we can also look at the timeline related to Saturn-Pluto and Saturn-Uranus when we go all the way into the 2070s and stretching through the 2040s. The interesting part of the 2050s is going to come with the fact that not only do we get a new Saturn-Pluto wave, again, Saturn-Pluto waves are great significators of main historical episodes. We also get the midpoint of the Saturn-Uranus wave, and if we look with the legacy of at least 20th century Saturn-Uranus waves, we have the 1919 one, which was of course, post-World War reactions, not only in Germany, but in the United States. It wasn't a calm period in the United States or in Germany. There was a Red Scare, there was a number of riots, there was a number of nasty turn to racism in the United States around after the end of World War I. and of course there was a lot of turmoil in Germany and of course Europe after the end of World War One. And then if we look in 1965, that's the other midpoint of Saturn-Uranus, and of course we can point to that as being the culture wars of the 1960s, and the culture wars seem to continue into the 2010s. So the 2050s is the next Saturn-Uranus opposition, and we should note that in connection with this our other part of this survey. Now, I admit I haven't gone and looked all the way back through history and seen the what is the tendency or the legacy of the Saturn-Uranus, Saturn-Pluto connection, but I think that the ones dating back to the 19th century through the 21st century shows it's a significant indicator of turning points in history, and one to note in particular, and one we should look for in the 2020s and the 2040s, and note as to being related to turning points that we know of the 1930s and the 1960s, and one that we're going through now, the 2010s with the Arab Revolution, the way that fundamental the fundamental changes that are taking place across the globe with China, with the United States, with the emerging economies, obviously is a historical turning point, and 2010 definitely fits in with the signature of Saturn Uranus and Saturn Pluto, as we've seen in the survey. And of course, if you like these videos, please go to the Waves blog. Measuringhistory.com is how you get there. You can also see a significant activity at Measuring History on Facebook, and there's a connection between Measuring History on Facebook and the Waves blog. And please feel free to leave comments, to click, to purchase anything that's available through the site, visit our sponsors, etc. And thank you very much for watching. Also, make sure to subscribe to the Measuring History channel on YouTube.